It started with a glance, then a touch, then a moment that changed everything. She was hired to care for their child, but no one knew she would become the reason their marriage unraveled. She told herself it was nothing at first, a harmless exchange of smiles, a fleeting moment of warmth. But then came the accidental brush of fingers, the stolen glances across the living room, the lingering scent of his cologne that clung to the air long after he had passed by. She tried to ignore it, to convince herself it was just admiration, just curiosity. But the way his gaze lingered on her, the way his voice softened when he said her name, made it impossible to deny. Late at night, when the house was silent and she lay in bed, she replayed the moments together. His laughter, his touch, the unspoken tension that neither of them dared to name. She wasn't supposed to feel this way. He wasn't supposed to notice her, but he did. And she wanted him to. And then there was the night it all changed. A storm rattled the windows, the power flickered, and she found herself in the dim glow of candlelight, standing too close, breathing too deep. His wife was away, the baby asleep, and in that moment the air between them was thick with something undeniable. He looked at her, really looked at her, and she knew. There was no turning back. Her face in the sky was a skeleton of a woman. Temptation never announces itself. It lingers in the quiet moments, in stolen glances, in the spaces where words are left unsaid. It doesn't start with passion, it starts with possibility, a possibility that should never have existed. She was hired to care for their son, nothing more. A job, a responsibility, a role with clear boundaries. And yet, the moment Zahra stepped into their home, something shifted, something delicate, something dangerous. Omar felt it before he could name it. A quiet pull, a curiosity that wrapped itself around him like a whisper he wasn't supposed to hear. It wasn't supposed to hear. She was different, not in the way men typically notice women, but in a way that unsettled him. The way she carried herself, modest yet graceful. The way her voice never rose above what was necessary, yet always held his attention. The way her presence filled the room, even in silence. She never tried to stand out, never asked for attention, but that's exactly what made her impossible to ignore. At first it was innocent. A passing glance, a casual conversation, a fleeting moment of eye contact that lingered a second too long, and then a touch. Barely there, but enough to leave a mark. Enough to leave them both wondering, was it accidental? Or it should have ended there, a line drawn, a temptation ignored. But some desires refuse to be silenced, and once the door is left even slightly open, it's only a matter of time before someone steps through. It wasn't a single moment. It was a slow, burning desire, a stolen touch when passing by, a lingering gaze, a whispered thank you, that carried more meaning than it should have. At first, they both told themselves it was nothing, a fleeting attraction, a momentary lapse in judgment. But with every passing day, it became harder to pretend. Zahra was careful. She kept her distance. Always just a little too formal, too polite, too proper. But even in her restraint, Omar could see it. There was something in the way her eyes softened when they met his. Something in the way her lips barely parted when she spoke to him. Something more than mere kindness. He resisted it. He had to. She was just the nanny. She was just another person in his house, another responsibility in his busy life. And yet, every time their paths crossed, he couldn't ignore the way his pulse quickened, the way his breath hitched, the way his body betrayed him when he was near her. But it wasn't just him. Zahra could feel it too. The way the air thickened when he stepped into the room, the way her skin tingled when their hands brushed. She told herself it was wrong. He was her employer, married, off limits. But there was a magnetic pull that neither of them could deny. A forbidden chemistry that crackled between them, setting them both on edge. It wasn't the sort of desire that would disappear with time. It only grew stronger. Like a flame that fed on its own hunger, it spread through every interaction, every glance, every word. She tried to ignore it. He tried to resist it, but the more they tried to suppress it, the more impossible it became to avoid. One evening, as rain tapped against the windows, they found themselves standing under the same umbrella, trapped outside. It should have been an ordinary moment, two people caught in a downpour, taking shelter together, but it wasn't. The space between them was electric, charged with something neither could put into words. His shoulder brushed against hers, once, twice. It was accidental, they told themselves, but they both felt it, the heat, the closeness, the undeniable chemistry that was there and yet wasn't supposed to be. And then there were the small things, the touches that couldn't be ignored. The way her hand shook just slightly when she handed him a plate, the way her breath caught when he leaned in too close to reach for something, the moments that made their hearts race, even though they knew they shouldn't feel this way. At dinner, with Layla talking about something mundane, the world seemed to fade away. Zahra passed him a dish, their fingers brushing briefly, a flash of heat, a quick, stolen glance. His eyes locking with hers, and just for a moment, the world outside disappeared. Layla continued talking, unaware of the tension that hung between them, so thick it was almost tangible. But Zahra couldn't look away. She knew it was dangerous. She knew it could ruin everything. But the temptation, was too strong, and in that moment, neither of them cared about the consequences. No one plans to betray until the moment it happens, and when it does, there's no going back. The lines blur, the rules no longer apply. It's just the heat of the moment, the overpowering desire, and the way it feels to finally give in. You tell yourself it's a mistake, just one fleeting moment that will pass. But once you cross that line, you realize there's no returning to the person you were before. It was late that night when it happened. The house was quiet, the kind of stillness that settled in after the world had gone to sleep. Layla was away on a business trip, and Adam had long been tucked into bed. It was just Zahra and Omar, alone. The way the shadows played on the walls, the dim light from the living room lamp, it felt different somehow, forbidden, intimate. Zahra was folding the laundry, her movements delicate, almost hypnotic. Omar sat on the couch, watching her, though neither of them spoke. The silence was thick, like it held its breath in anticipation. It had been building for weeks. The tension, the need, the attraction that neither of them could ignore anymore. She wasn't supposed to be here. She wasn't supposed to feel this way. He wasn't supposed to look at her like that. But there it was, an undeniable connection, one that had been simmering under the surface for so long, it was about to boil over. The moment she turned to him, their eyes locked. His gaze was intense, almost pleading, like he was trying to speak without words. She felt it, the electricity, the pulse that throbbed between them. She could feel the heat of his stare, like it was burning into her skin. She swallowed hard, but the words wouldn't come. She wanted to say something, anything, but all that escaped her lips was a soft, breathless gasp. He stood up then, slowly, as if testing the waters, as if he, too, was questioning whether this was real. He reached for her, a slow, deliberate movement that made her heart race. She froze, torn between the desire that was consuming her and the voice in her head that screamed, "This isn't you. This isn't who you are." But the temptation, it was too strong. His fingers grazed her cheek, and she inhaled sharply, a rush of warmth flooding her chest. The touch was gentle, but the air between them was thick with something far more dangerous. Something they had both been ignoring for far too long. Zahra's lips parted slightly, her breath shallow, as though every part of her body was fighting to resist, even as her heart begged her to give in. And then, in that fragile moment, everything else faded away. There was no right, no wrong, no consequences. Only them. He leaned in, his lips brushing against her ear as he whispered her name. And that was it. That was the moment she stopped fighting. That was the moment she gave in. The kiss was gentle at first, hesitant even, like they were both testing the waters, afraid of the weight it carried. But then it deepened, a shared breath, a hunger neither could deny anymore. The fire that had smoldered between them for weeks finally ignited, and in that fire, they both burned. She could feel his hands on her back, pulling her closer, the heat of his body pressing against hers. It was like a dream, like something she had only ever imagined but never thought would happen. And yet, here they were, crossing a line that neither of them could uncross. Omar pulled away, his eyes searching hers, filled with guilt, regret, and a strange, undeniable longing. She felt it too, the guilt, the shame, but also something else, something deeper. He turned away, his eyes falling on the wedding photo on the mantel, the image of him and Layla, smiling, oblivious to the secret that was unfolding in this very room. The guilt washed over him, and for a fleeting moment, he wondered how it had come to this. How had he let it go this far? But Zahra didn't look away. She wasn't sure if she was ashamed or relieved. The part of her that had held onto the boundaries, the lines, was now lost in the fire of their desire, and she knew, as much as she wanted to deny it, there was no going back. They met in the shadows, stolen moments of ecstasy hidden beneath a veil of guilt. No one saw the whispers, the stolen glances, the heated touches that grew between them like a fire they couldn't put out, no matter how hard they tried. The truth was simple. Neither of them had planned it. No, it wasn't supposed to happen like this. But when the world is silent and you're alone with your desires, the line between right and wrong becomes nothing more than a faint echo. It was always in the quietest moments, the ones no one else would notice. A glance across the room, a brush of fingertips as they reached for the same object. Those little sparks that lit the fuse, and before they knew it, they were caught in the flames. Zahra couldn't help herself. It wasn't just his charm, his confidence, or the way he looked at her that sent her heart racing. It was something deeper, something dangerous, like the taste of forbidden fruit, sweet and irresistible. And Omar? He couldn't stop it either. He fought it at first. He told himself it was just a passing attraction, something to forget the moment he left the house. But every time he saw her, every time their eyes met, the pull was stronger. The forbidden pull that had wrapped itself around him like chains. They met in secret, under the cover of darkness, when no one could see the spark in their eyes, the hunger that flashed between them. It wasn't just about passion. No, it was about something deeper. Something that took them both to a place they weren't sure they could come back from. Zahra's phone buzzed in her pocket. Another message from Omar. Her fingers shook as she read it. Words that were too bold for what they were supposed to be. Words that set her blood on fire, that sent a thrill through her body. She could feel the excitement building in her chest, the adrenaline coursing through her veins. It wasn't love, no, not yet. But it was something much darker, much more thrilling. She smiled as she deleted the message, her lips curling into a secret, knowing smile. No one knew. No one would ever know. It was their secret, hidden behind the curtains of their lives, tucked away in the moments that belonged only to them. She had become addicted to the danger of it, the thrill of hiding in plain sight. Every stolen moment, every forbidden touch, only made the fire inside of her burn hotter. But each time they crossed that line, each time they gave in to what they knew was wrong, the guilt followed them like a shadow. It crept into their minds, tugged at their hearts, whispered that this was a mistake, that it would all come crashing down sooner or later. And yet, neither of them could stop. They couldn't resist the dangerous pull that had taken over their every thought, every breath. They were like two magnets drawn together, despite all the consequences, despite the promises they'd made to themselves and others. It was late when they met again, the moon casting its pale glow through the bedroom window. The air was thick, heavy with the tension they could no longer deny. They were alone now, just the two of them, the weight of their actions hanging between them. Her breath hitched as she felt his hand on her back, the touch both comforting and electric. He kissed her slowly, his lips firm, but she could feel the hesitation there, the regret, the fear that they were teetering on the edge of something they couldn't control. But even in that hesitation, she felt the heat rise, the pressure build. She couldn't stop herself. Neither could he. The moment they shared in that room, the stolen kisses, the heated passion, it felt like both freedom and a prison. Her body ached for him, a desire that had built up over weeks of careful restraint. He had become her obsession, and in that moment, she no longer cared about the consequences. It didn't matter if it was right or wrong. The only thing that mattered was that they were together now. And for that brief moment, nothing else existed. But after it all, the silence that followed was deafening. Guilt weighed on them like 1,000 pounds. They pulled away, the distance between them now heavier than the passion they had just shared. It was as if the space between them held all the words they couldn't say, all the truths they refused to face. Zahra looked at him, her heart racing, her mind spinning. She knew it wasn't over. This dangerous dance was far from finished. The question wasn't whether it would continue, it was whether they could escape the consequences. And for a moment, just a fleeting moment, she wondered if they ever could. Layla sensed it before she saw it. A woman always knows when her husband begins to slip away. It's in the small things. The way his gaze lingers a little too long on someone else. The way his touch feels just a bit more distant, even when he's right there beside her. She could feel the shift in the air, the subtle tension that had begun to fill the space between them like an unspoken truth. At first, she brushed it off. Work stress, maybe, or the weight of the world bearing down on him. But as the days passed, the cracks began to show. The man who once came home early, eager to spend time with her and their son, was now always late. The excuses became more frequent, more strained, and when he was home, his mind wasn't with her. He was lost in his phone, his thoughts somewhere far beyond their little family. But it wasn't until that one evening, when Leela sat in the quiet of their bedroom, the glow of her husband's phone screen reflecting in her eyes, that she knew something wasn't right. Her fingers trembled as she picked it up, her heart racing with the kind of anxiety she hadn't felt in years. She told herself it was just curiosity, just a feeling of being a little too far removed from the man she had once known so well. She opened the messages, and for a moment, the world stopped. Her breath caught in her throat, the words on the screen clear but somehow incomprehensible. It was a conversation between Omar and Zahra, one she'd never intended to see. The flirtations, the subtle exchanges, the late-night texts that spoke volumes more than the simple words they contain. A coldness washed over her as she read them over and over again. The words were a dagger to her chest, each one driving deeper into her heart. She had known, she had felt it. Something. But to see it in black and white, to see the proof of the betrayal that had quietly wormed its way into her life, it was more than she could bear. Layla's hand shook as she put the phone down, her mind racing. She couldn't breathe. The reality of what she was facing, the truth she had hoped she would never have to acknowledge, was now undeniable. Upstairs, Zahra had felt the shift too. The way Layla had started looking at her differently, the subtle tension when they crossed paths in the house. Zahra could no longer pretend that everything was normal. Her smile, once warm and welcoming, now felt forced, and her hands trembled every time Layla's gaze fell on her. The guilt, the fear, they were suffocating her. The stolen moments, the quiet glances, the secret affair she had tried to bury under layers of her own denial, now weighed on her like a millstone around her neck. That morning, as she adjusted her hijab and hurried to gather Adam for his day with her, she felt Layla's eyes on her, piercing, knowing. Zahra could hardly meet her gaze, her hands fumbling with the boy's toys in a desperate attempt to focus on something, anything, other than the burning weight of the suspicion hanging between them. And Omar? Omar was coming home late again that evening, his steps slow, his eyes tired. But there was something else, something in the way he looked at Layla, the way he avoided her, that told her everything she needed to know. The door closed behind him with an almost imperceptible click, but in that sound, everything changed. There was no warmth in his greeting, no eagerness to embrace her. just the heavy silence that stretched between them, both of them now aware of the unspoken truths that had begun to erode the foundation of their marriage. Layla watched him, the air thick with tension. She could feel the lie, the deception, like a thick fog between them. It was there in every word he didn't say, in every gesture that felt just a little too distant. And she knew that the facade they had built for so many years was crumbling, piece by piece, right before her eyes. And Zahra? Zahra couldn't escape the reality of the situation any longer. The affair was no longer just a secret between her and Omar. It was a secret that could unravel everything, destroy everything, and with every passing second, the pressure mounted. What had started as a quiet, desperate escape from her own loneliness now threatened to consume her. The truth, once revealed, is a blade that cuts deep, and in this case, it was fatal. It started quietly, like a low hum in the background of their lives, a whisper that could easily be ignored. But the moment it pierced through the silence, there is no taking it back. There is no softening the blow when the truth bursts forth like a storm, leaving destruction in its wake. Layla had known the time was coming, the moment when everything would finally shatter. She had felt the distance between them grow, had watched as her husband became a stranger, slipping further away with each passing day. But nothing could have prepared her for the devastating confrontation that was about to unfold. That night, she couldn't hold it in anymore. The knot in her stomach had tightened to the point of suffocation, and with trembling hands, she confronted him. She didn't need to ask him about the messages. She didn't need him to speak a word. She had seen it all, read it all. Everything she needed to know was now written in ink on the screen of his phone, and she wasn't going to pretend she didn't understand. Not the past 10 years. Didn't she understand there was more? How long, she had asked, her voice a mix of disbelief and raw anger. She couldn't look at him, not yet, not with the way her heart was breaking. Omar froze, his eyes avoiding hers, the guilt written across his face like a scar. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words were too heavy, too tangled in the web of lies they had woven. There was no easy way out, no simple apology that could fix what he had done. How long? Layla's voice cracked as she repeated the question. She wasn't going to back down, not this time. She had loved him, trusted him, and he had betrayed that trust. With the one person she thought she could count on. The room was suffocating now, thick with the weight of their past, their future, everything they had built, teetering on the edge of destruction. Meanwhile, across town, Zahra sat in the dim light of her apartment, her hands shaking as she read the message from Omar. The words blurred before her eyes as guilt gripped her chest. She knew the confrontation was inevitable. She could feel the weight of it, the crash of reality about to hit. And yet, nothing could prepare her for the consequences of their actions. She had told herself it was just a moment of weakness, a fleeting escape from her own loneliness. But now, as she stared at the phone screen, she understood. She had crossed a line, and now there was no going back. She couldn't stay hidden forever. Layla knew, and Omar knew. She had to face the music, face the woman she had betrayed and the family she had shattered. But how could she ever make it right? How could she ever undo what had been done? Back at home, Omar stood there, his wedding ring still on his finger, but it might as well have been a shackle binding him to his sins. He was lost, trapped in the web of his own making. He had destroyed his own life, his own family, and there was no way to fix it. Layla had wanted to believe in him. She had wanted to trust him, to believe that their love was enough. But now, with every tear that fell from her eyes, every word that came out of her mouth, she realized that it wasn't enough. Trust, once broken, could never be fully repaired. And Omar? He could barely look at her. His world was in ruins, and there was no escape. The truth had come for him, and it had struck with a force he couldn't deny. The silence that followed was deafening. Neither of them spoke, unable to find the words that might ease the pain, the betrayal. The love they once shared was no longer a comfort, it was a reminder of everything they had lost. Affairs don't just destroy marriages, they destroy people. The dust had settled, but the damage was done. What began as an innocent touch, a fleeting glance, had turned into something far darker. Something neither Zahra, Omar, nor Layla could have ever anticipated. The wreckage was everywhere, sprawled out across their lives like the aftermath of a storm. And in the quiet that followed, the weight of what had been lost was suffocating. And in the quiet that followed, notwithstanding the tragedy that had taken place, the severed head cast aside for far more cruelty and violence. Zahra stood at the threshold of the house, a single suitcase in her hand. The house she had once entered with such hope, such eagerness, now felt foreign to her. She had never imagined it would come to this, her leaving in the dead of night, eyes brimming with shame and regret. She glanced back one last time, but the house, their home, offered nothing to her but cold silence. There were no warm goodbyes, no forgiveness waiting in the wings, just emptiness. She had taken what was never hers to take. She had built this illusion of love, of connection, but now she knew it was nothing but a fleeting distraction. The guilt settled deep in her chest, suffocating her with its weight. How had she let it go so far? She had betrayed the woman who had welcomed her into their lives, who had trusted her with everything. And for what? A stolen moment of affection? The fleeting excitement of forbidden pleasure? It wasn't worth it. Nothing was worth this. But it was too late to take it all back. Layla, on the other hand, was trapped in a different kind of prison. The betrayal had fractured something deep within her, and now all she could do was sit in silence. She had found herself in the same cafe every morning since the truth had been revealed, her untouched coffee growing cold, just like the love she had once shared with Omar. She had once believed in forever, believed that love, loyalty, and trust were enough to carry them through anything. But now, all of it had been shattered, scattered across the floor like glass shards, too sharp to pick up without cutting herself. She had spent years building a life with Omar, nurturing their family, raising their son, and now the future she had imagined was nothing but a cruel mirage, disappearing before her eyes. Leela's fingers traced the edge of the coffee cup, but she didn't lift it to her lips. She wasn't hungry. She wasn't thirsty. She was just empty. The life she had thought she knew no longer existed. She felt as though she was drifting in a world she no longer recognized, and the person she had trusted most, her husband, her partner, had become a stranger to her. "You are not the one I knew." Her mind kept returning to the moment the truth came crashing down. The look on Omar's face when she confronted him, the coldness in his eyes, the weight of guilt that hung between them. He had shattered her trust, but she had already seen the cracks in their marriage long before that moment. And then there was Omar, left alone with the weight of his choices. He sat in the dark room, the silence pressing in around him, his hands shaking as they held the letter from Layla, divorce papers. His future crumbled with every word on those pages, and the reality of what he had done hit him harder than any physical blow could. He had destroyed everything, his marriage, his family, and his own sense of self. So what? His eyes traced the words, but they blurred in front of him. The weight of regret crushed him with every passing second. He had betrayed the woman he vowed to love and protect. He had betrayed the mother of his child. And now he was left to pick up the pieces of a life that had once seemed perfect, but had now been reduced to ashes. Omar's hands trembled as he set the letter down, his mind replaying the events leading up to this moment. He had allowed himself to be consumed by temptation, by the rush of desire, and in the process, he had lost everything. He knew there was no turning back. The pain of knowing that he had irreparably damaged everything he once held dear was a burden he could never escape. Was Zahra a villain or a victim? Was Omar's marriage already doomed from the start? In the end, was it love that bound them together, or was it simply the heat of lust that had consumed them both? You've heard the story, but what do you believe? The question echoes in the silence that follows, leaving behind a void that can't be filled. Was Zahra truly the cause of their undoing, or was she just a catalyst for a broken marriage that had long been fraying at the edges? Was she merely a woman caught in the tangled web of her own desires, or something darker? Someone who knew exactly what she was doing from the very start. And Omar, was he ever truly committed? Or had his heart already strayed long before Zahra entered their lives, seeking solace in a fleeting affair? Or perhaps it was simply the perfect storm, two hearts, longing for something they couldn't find, colliding in a world that no longer made sense. The truth is, sometimes love isn't enough to save a marriage. Sometimes it's something else entirely that tears everything apart. Was it weakness? Was it anger? Or was it something even more dangerous, a need so deep, so hidden, that not even the people involved truly understood it? Now, as we watch these lives unravel, we're left with the ultimate question. In a world where everything can change in an instant, where trust is shattered and betrayal is inevitable, can we ever truly understand the line between right and wrong, between love and lust? So what do you think? Was Zahra a villain, or was she just a woman lost in a moment of temptation? Was Omar's marriage always doomed, or did he push it to the edge knowing exactly what would happen? And in the end, was this a story of love, or was it a tale of two souls lost in something far darker? I want to hear from you. Comment below and let me know where you stand. Could you ever forgive such a betrayal? Could you ever trust again after everything that's been said and done? And if you want more stories like this, real-life tales of love, betrayal, and heartbreak, hit that subscribe button. You don't want to miss what's coming next.